Welcome to the Modern Arizona podcast. Today's podcast is a little different. It's from one of our live events with the Modern Divorce Navigator, designed to make divorce less stressful and more manageable. If you enjoy the podcast, don't forget to subscribe. And if you're curious about the Navigator, check out the link in the description. We would love to have you join us. Now let's dive back into the episode. Hello and welcome to the Modern Arizona podcast. I am here joined by domestic violence expert witness, Dr. David Adams. David, welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Glad to have you here. You do a lot. You have worked with domestic abusers for more than 40 years.
Yeah, 45 years.
Let's talk about that. Can people who are abusive learn to be not abusive? And how often does it happen?
Yes. So I can tell you about my program specifically. My program's called Emerge in Boston. And so I've been working there for 45 years. So the study that was done, our outcome study, independent study that was done by Kennedy School of Government found that 11.7% of our program completers had reoffended and 20% overall. So those are really good results. I think the key is staying in the program long enough. Our program is 40 weeks.
Okay.
And so those who complete the program or come close to completing do much better than those that don't. Twice is, 2 to 3 times better, basically. So that's kind of reassuring. I think that part of what we're dealing with is kind of a quick fix mentality, right? So they kind of like sometimes want to go through cosmetic changes and then kind of want to get their partners to drop all charges against them, let them back in the house, and so forth. And so we kind of point out it doesn't work that way. There's a process you have to go through to regain trust with somebody that you've been abusive to.
Well, I think that's really good news, though. 80% of abusers who will take the time to commit to the program won't reoffend. Do we think those numbers are underreported?
Well, so that study looked at rearrests and new restraining orders. And so that's not the same thing as talking to the victim to find out whether there's been any continued psychological abuse. Now, we do, as part of our program, we do extensive outreach to the victims, partners of the people who attend our program. And so we have a pretty good read of what's going on, whether there's any ongoing abuse. And so we feel that those numbers are pretty good, in terms of representing those who really make real and lasting changes compared to those who are trying to manipulate, and to con their ways through the program.
Does it come down to essentially a belief system and changing a belief system? Is that the difference between someone who's an abuser and a non-abuser?
I think so. Yeah. I think that probably the core psychological trait of most abusers would be narcissism or self-centeredness. And I think along with that is this, not so much a belief, Billy, it's more like a sense of entitlement or a sense that my partner should defer to me, basically, and I think part of what abusers do is they kind of control the agenda, of the relationship. And so they basically, over time, only their complaints count, in the relationship. At the beginning, there's a kind of a honeymoon stage. There's, what we call love bombing, at the beginning. And so many victims that we talk to, the partners say, I want the person that I first started dating, right? I want the person who was sweet, thoughtful, considerate. And but instead, there was a pretty sharp turning point in cases where it turned into this sort of like sense of ownership, sense of entitlement, jealous thinking, the very things that they're attracted to. We do a kind of a fascinating relationship history with the men in our and I say men, but it's mostly men. We do have women who are in our program, but they basically say that they're initially attracted to her. She's friendly, she's independent, she's very sweet, she's very loving. And then ultimately they start to get bothered by those very same characteristics. She's too
Wow.
friendly, right? She's too independent, right?
Hmm.
And so it's kind of like reflects this sort of like I think superficial, almost like what's the word? Instrumental kind of way of having a relationship, over time. Um,
Why do you think that that is, that somebody would be attracted to someone's independence and then hate it? Why would that be?
well, I don't know. I mean, I think that it's kind of like the ability to kind of understand the difference between an ideal, because I think most abusers idealize or romanticize their relationship, their partner at the beginning, but ultimately they can't stand being with a real woman,
Hmm.
who has flaws,
Hmm.
who's is contradictory. Over time, she doesn't get to be contradictory like I do. She doesn't get
Hmm.
to be complicated like I do. She doesn't get
Hmm.
to be enigmatic like I do.
Hmm.
So that there's this kind of like somehow this intolerance, I think, of her being a real person. You
Of
know?
her humanity, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Because humanity is irritating.
yeah. Right, exactly.
All right. So then what is the process over the 40-week? Are there certain stages that people go
Yeah,
through?
yeah. Yeah, they
Okay.
go through two phases. The first phase is an educational segment, first 8 weeks, and there's basic lessons like what is abusive behavior. Most abusers greatly minimize. They have a very narrow definition. It's only hitting somebody that counts. So that we kind of broaden their understanding of what abusive behavior is. It isn't just physical violence; it's psychological abuse, economic abuse, and so forth. Coercive control. um, we have a lesson about the effects of abusive behavior on partners, and the kind of the interesting thing about that, Billy, is that some of the men will kind of like will start with a brainstorm, like so distrust. Your partner distrusts you. Your partner is unhappy much of the time. Your partner avoids you, and the interesting thing is that they will say, "Well, yeah, see, that's what my partner. See what I'm dealing with. She's never happy, for Christ's sakes." So they don't connect it to their abusive behavior. They think that they're bringing kind of almost like a victim mentality, to the situation, and thinking I'm with somebody who's impossible to please,
Sure.
rather than having the second phase is really longer phase, and that's where we do problem solving, and so that's where we get into, okay, so how do you actually respond to things that your partner is unhappy about, and so are you responding in a way that is dismissive, or
Right.
shutting her down, or blaming, raising counter accusations, or are you actually listening to the things that are important, the things that her concerns, her worries, her anxiety, she's tired, and so sort of educating them about, it's called empathy, right? I mean,
Right.
so, recognizing your partner has real feelings, and if you're not listening to her, if you're not taking the time to understand, her experience, then really it's going to be impossible for you to have a good relationship with her. And that's your doing. That's nothing about her. Right?
Right.
That's a dynamic you're creating.
So this is resonating. They're taking some accountability because that's what it's going to require accountability and self,
Yeah.
like recognizing the flaws in oneself in order to change. Now, usually the partners have been trying that. What is it that what it what makes it click?
Well, I think that part of it comes back to male socialization, Billy. I think that men kind of grow up almost being socialized to expect women to be their emotional caretakers.
Hmm.
So if I'm unhappy, if I'm frustrated, then somehow she's to blame for that.
Hmm.
I mean, my father was like that. My father used to say, I grew up in a violent home. And so my father used to
Hmm.
say, see how you make me feel. All right. So, and even as a 6-year-old, I thought that was weird that my father would like try to make me feel responsible for his feelings. Right.
Yeah.
And so I think many of the men who go through a program, they've literally never not had like a mother or a partner, who is basically they expect to assume responsibility for their feelings. And as a result, they don't learn how to manage their own feelings, their boredom, their depression, their anger, their anxiety, all the things, that go into being an adult, right? Of learning
Right.
to manage our own feelings, right?
Right. Right. Okay. So it's interesting you say that. I just read an article in the past couple days that referenced adolescent
Mm,
violence
yes,
within adolescent relationships and how it is quite prevalent.
that's right.
And as I was reading it, like it makes sense. I have teenagers, like they're immature. And that's what this is kind of. It's immaturity.
Mhm.
It's unwillingness to deal with your own,
That's right.
stuff. So, but it's concerning as well. So
Yes.
how should we be addressing and equipping our teenagers for that possibility?
Well, yeah, it's interesting you mentioned teens because we also have a free parenting education class that's available to all the people who are attending the abuser intervention program. And so
Mm,
for some of them, post separation, post divorce, it's the first time they've had to assume any kind of responsibility for their children because they've always relied on the other partner to do it. And interestingly, they're more motivated in some ways to do right by their children,
sure.
and yet they lack certain skills, like how do you soothe a crying child, how do you kind of like um because how do you kind of respond to kids who are angry at you,
Mhm.
right? How do you rebuild trust with people? I mean, so we have a nice exercise. It's called this 7 signs of respect, and we kind of go through each one of those. For instance, and they're all framed in terms of what are your children observing in your interactions with the other parent? So
Mm,
listening is one of the signs of respect. How much do they see you listening to the other parent? How much do
mhm,
they see you thanking the other parent, which
mhm.
is a respect of recognizing what they're contributing, right? Appreciating.
Definitely.
How much do they see you respecting the other parent's boundaries? Physical boundaries, time boundaries, privacy? How much do they see you showing interest in the other parent's interests or opinions, right? Um, and so we're making it very concrete, and we're helping them to see if you are not doing those, if you're not role modeling those, and some of those are invisible because kids are keen observers. They
Yeah.
observe all those interactions between
Mhm,
parents, right? And
mhm.
so and it's upsetting to the men to see how much they are not really doing what they should be doing, um, letting their kids down by not setting an example to their children about how to show respect. And then we go through 5 signs of empathy, right? Too, and same thing, similar process. And so it's really, I think that for many men, though, it's literally the first time they've had that type of education. Really, I mean, they really haven't. Particularly if you grow up in a home where that's not demonstrated, right?
Yeah.
Um,
There is this current cultural backlash against this type of education.
that's right. That's right. Right.
And I think we as a society are grappling with the concept of masculinity and really
That's right.
struggling.
That's right.
Can you tell me your thoughts on that and on masculinity?
Yes. I mean, I think that there's been, you're right, kind of almost like a backlash and this whole kind of desire on the part of some people to kind of want to be more positive about men. And it's coming from a place of seeing that men are being left behind in some
Yeah.
way. The economy, is not as set up for manual tasks, for instance, and
Right.
men aren't going to college as much as they used to. So I understand where that's coming from, but I don't think the solution is to see men as victims, in relationships. I think that all the more important to teach men and boys the skills that they're going to need to have successful relationships, and so rejection is one of those things, right? I mean, I think I heard one senator say that it goes so far as to blame women for mass shootings by men, that hadn't been rejected by a woman, somehow they wouldn't be compelled to kill. I mean, that's so crazy. But I think for us, it reflects that let's teach young men how to accept rejection. It's such a part of life, right? I
Right.
mean, my first girlfriend broke up with me. At midnight, over the phone, and I got on a bicycle and rode 5 miles down to her house and had no clue about what I was going to do when I got to her house. It was midnight and it was
Mhm.
closed up. I mean, but it felt like it was the end of the world for me, that,
Yeah,
I had no sense I was going to have other relationships in my life.
sure.
And so I think it's a learning experience, ideally. I think when you get rejected or when not even rejected, but when you get feedback in a relationship, you know what? I feel like you're too possessive, right? uh, I mean, I think that we should be able to be self-reflective about that and to welcome that kind of feedback from partners, if we're doing things that are not optimal for a relationship, that are not respectful to a partner, or that are just rude or inconsiderate or thoughtless or whatever, to learn from our mistakes.
I think one of the problems is that um the the portion of the culture that feels like masculinity is being attacked
Right.
somehow feels like the teaching of emotional intelligence or emotional accountability or controlling your emotions or being emotionally aware is somehow the feminization of the culture.
Right. Right.
How did we get there?
I don't know. I feel that mentality is anti-male more than anything. I think it's basically saying that giving up on men being able to be, socially aware, being able to be emotionally intelligent, which is
Right.
just essential for being a partner or a parent, right?
Right.
Um,
Or succeeding at work or getting
that's right.
promotions at your job.
That's
Like,
right.
really, you want to be the most successful version of yourself. You have to have the ability to process your own emotions.
That's right. No, that's a good point. So I think it's just that different skills have become important in our economy too. I mean,
Mhm.
so many jobs are no longer now just manufacturing jobs. There are jobs that involve, like you said, getting along with other people, right? And so it just behooves men, I think, to learn those skills,
Why do you think there are some men who are very good at the
Mm.
corporate ladder? They can manage themselves in every environment except within a
That's
relationship.
right. Yes, I think that I'm glad you pointed that out. I think it's probably the single biggest myth about abusers, that they are across the board abusive to everybody. When in fact many of them are very good workers,
Hmm.
and very good. Even in homicide, I've studied homicide and wrote a book about intimate partner homicides. What do the neighbors say about the killers? That
Yeah.
he was such a nice guy, right? I
Mhm.
didn't see this coming. So I think that is a part of the character profile of abusers, is to kind of compartmentalize, to sort of be good in a way, where it counts and where it matters, at work, but then at the same time to take their partners for granted, you know, um, yeah, to have a
I
double identity almost.
Yeah, I want to talk to you about your book. Why do they kill? Um, Men who murder their intimate partners. Many, many women, whether they have experienced violence in their relationship or not,
Right.
are very afraid when it comes time to divorce.
That's right.
How can we as lawyers and how can people do an accurate risk assessment
Mm.
if they are going into a divorce?
Well, I do think, I mean, as an expert witness, I'm asked to do a risk assessment quite often. I get calls from lawyers all the time that are basically representing a woman who's going through divorce, and the lawyer's asking me, is it safe
Right.
for my client to divorce him? I mean, some abusers are just obsessed with money, and the material assets, that they've accumulated, and so some of the killers I interviewed, that's what actually triggered them, was
Really?
more than even losing their partner, losing the material assets of the marriage, and so I think that it is important to kind of be able to assess the level of danger, that we're dealing with there, because you're right. I mean, the most dangerous point for any woman who's in an abusive relationship is ending, leaving the partner.
Mhm.
Basically.
So what are the biggest indicators that someone might be dangerous?
So, first of all, past threats. Has the person actually made threats? And what I learned is that it's not just the presence of threats, but the frequency of threats. So that in the cases that I studied, and I interviewed victims of attempted homicide as well as killers, two incarcerated killers, and I found that the frequency of the threats really mattered. And it's almost as if person was psyching themselves up to do what they've threatened to do, um, and normalizing it almost, right? And so some of the killers said the more I said it, the more real it was so that I could do it.
Wow.
Yeah. Um, One of the men said, actually, I was comforted by that thought that that was an option. I didn't think I'd ever need to do it, meaning I didn't think she'd ever leave me, but I was comforted by that thought that I could do that. Yeah. And so that's really, we used to think of threats as just blowing off steam, but now we begin to think of threats as plans.
Threats are plans.
So the
Okay.
more recent they are, the more frequent they are, and the context is important. So are the threats given in a context of a partner saying that she wants to end the relationship, or making plans for that, and so forth. So threats is a big deal. Has there been, is gun ownership is a huge factor,
Okay.
yeah. And so I'm working on a second book on homicide right now. And so I'm looking at differences between states that have high intimate partner homicide rates and those that have low. So for instance, Massachusetts has the lowest intimate partner homicide rate in the country. Um,
Wow.
but we also have 12%, no, 14% gun ownership rate in Massachusetts.
Wow.
If you look at a state like Tennessee or Texas, they're like 60% gun ownership rate.
Yeah.
And so just the availability of a gun is a huge difference maker
Hmm.
in terms of homicides, just the availability of a gun. Yeah.
Are most homicides from guns?
Yes, 75% on average, yeah, are guns.
Got it.
Strangulation is another thing, though. I mean, I think that if there's been prior strangulation, that's definitely a huge warning sign as well.
Okay. So threats, prior strangulation, anything else that
Gun ownership or gun
ownership?
availability, drinking, drugging,
Mm.
estrangement is definitely on the risk. It's one of the risk factor indicators. Stalking,
Hmm.
extreme jealousy. Actually, one of the interesting ones is pregnancy. And so women who are pregnant are actually more at risk.
Why?
Particularly having a child who's not yours. That's actually the indicator on the Jackie Campbell dangerous.
Oh, a woman who's pregnant with somebody else's child.
No, if
No.
you have a child in the home who's not yours.
Oh,
So basically, it's a reminder of her past,
wow.
right? And a lot of times those kids are not bought in to this new father figure, right? Who's abusive, right?
Right. Yeah. Why would you be?
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
Wow. Okay. When you are testifying in family court,
right.
is it usually focused on what is the proper child custody arrangement?
Yes, visitation or custody. Those are overwhelmingly the issues. And I think, unfortunately, what we're seeing a lot is in family court is that there's counterclaims of parental alienation, right? And so it's gotten to the point where many abusers are gaining custody, either sole or joint custody, and with this sort of claim that somehow she was not really a victim of abuse, that somehow she's fabricating this as a ploy to get the father out of the picture. The evidence about that is very clear, though, that's very unusual. It's very rare for somebody to kind of fabricate claims of abuse. And in fact, the opposite is true. The abusive person is the one who's alienating the children.
Well,
Uh,
what I usually see in these cases
uh,
is the victim claims abuse. The
mm,
perpetrator says she was abusive too,
right.
and has examples
That's right.
of times
Right.
when she physically lashed out. The
Right.
court finds they're both abusive
Right.
and then gives 50-50.
Right. And that's why I think an expert is useful, because I think that there's a difference between violence and what we'd call abuse reactive behavior, and so it's not unusual at all for victims of abuse to lash out, like you said.
Yeah.
And
Certainly over, like, we're talking, sometimes over a 20-year period, there's going to be some times.
and so it's you can't really look at one piece of behavior and say that that's abusive or not. You have to look at a pattern, of
Yeah.
coercive control, and that's why it's so important, I think, to have an expert to help not just the court, but the guardian ad litems, the
Hmm.
evaluators, to kind of recognize that there's a pattern of coercive control,
Hmm.
which really very much affects the interactions between the partners.
Do you often engage with evaluators?
Yes, yes. Quite often, I'm asked to kind of evaluate the guardian ad litem report, for instance,
Yeah.
to comment in terms of the level of diligence, to the report. Have they really done a proper assessment of domestic abuse?
Hmm.
And quite often they haven't. There's not a
Right.
lot of training there, to do that properly.
Yeah. So are they open to your feedback?
It varies. I think there have definitely been some cases where the guardian ad litems have been very influenced by my report and
Mm.
and and written, better reports as a result. And then there are others that are, I think, still kind of wedded to this idea of parental alienation, that they're not really trainable or teachable in that regard. They're very kind of locked in to the whole idea that this is a common thing that women do to men. It's a whole scorned woman kind of like thing, that she's only doing this because she's a scorned woman, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so what are the types of cases where you think your services are most valuable?
I think particularly cases where there hasn't been a lot of physical violence, I think it's difficult, I think, for courts to recognize a pattern of coercive control,
Right.
Also cases where the victim has not sought help previously,
Yeah.
has engaged in what you'd consider to be a lot of counterintuitive behavior, such as remaining with him or recanting prior allegations, or even
Hmm.
a child with the abusive partner, and so I think kind of helping the court to understand the real impact of domestic abuse, and how things that seemingly look like they're kind of even compliance or appeasement is a kind of a way of trying to manage your own safety, right?
Sure.
And I think it's difficult for people, juries as well as judges, to kind of recognize those underlying patterns.
Yeah. Let me see if we have any audience questions. No, not so far. That's excellent. All right. Here, let me see. Okay, so over your 44-year career,
Mm.
what changes have you seen in society's conceptions about domestic violence?
Well, it's funny. I think that there have been definitely changes in institutional practices, and so the police are much better overall in how they respond to domestic violence cases, with training and with partnerships they have with victim advocates, for instance. I think child welfare is a little bit better than they had been previously. I think it's still. I think sometimes I think what we've been seeing recently that's so disheartening is kind of like this backlash, right? And so there's been this sort of backlash against DEI and kind of like political correctness or whatever, the sensitivity to other people, and I think there's been this sort of like wish to retract from that, or kind of like somehow, feel like somehow that's created the problems, rather than the
Right.
fact we aren't quite there yet. We have never really quite been willing to accept newcomers. Women don't get the same level of respect. Don't still get the same economic opportunities as men, and I think that you can go backwards or forwards with that.
And in the 44 years, is this the first backslide you've seen?
It is, yeah. Yes, it is. I mean, I think that there was a lot of pretty steady progress, since the 70s, basically the women's movement. I think that there were a lot of changes in laws. I think the family courts is sort of the last refuge, so to speak. I think the criminal courts are doing much better.
Really?
Domestic violence. I think it's really the family courts that really have become the venue really where victims are re-victimized.
Yeah. Okay. So I want to understand that. What is the difference between what's happening in criminal court and what's happening in family court with regards to domestic abuse?
Well, I think that in family court, I know in criminal court, there's looking at the evidence. Has it been probable cause to make an arrest? It is. It's more black and white. I think family courts have a little bit different perspective. They're kind of looking at relationships, and they tend to sort of see everything in the context of the relationship. And so in a way, it sort of prevents them from kind of looking at behavior, and responsibility for one's own behavior. I'd like to point out that it doesn't matter if the relationship has a lot of conflict. If one person's being abusive, they're making a decision to be abusive, regardless, but somehow I think family courts sort of situationalize everything. They see everything as a response to a situation rather
Sure.
than more of a reflection of choices that people are making.
That makes a lot of sense. We've talked about the psychology of the abuser. Can we talk for a minute? I know we're over time, but I'd like to talk for a minute about the psychology of the victim.
Hmm.
What stages do the victims go through? What are critical things for victims to understand or know or experience in order to leave or make changes?
Well, I think that for victims, a lot of what I see in my work as an expert witness is women who say that they stayed in the relationship because they felt like they could make him a better person. They felt that if they could give him a family, and a sense of stability, that he somehow would be feel more secure over time, and come to appreciate all that she's doing to contribute to the relationship. I think that's sort of a lot of female socialization, right? I mean, so women
Right.
are socialized to feel responsible for not just relationships, but for partners in relationships. And so that can kind of be a trap, basically.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've got socialization problems going both ways.
Yeah.
And what is it that usually takes women to the point where they understand I'm not responsible for caretaking or fixing this person's life, or what needs to happen?
I think getting the right kind of help, I think that quite often what I've seen is that that's the turning point for many women, is that they've kind of put up with it, or spent a lot of their time and energy appeasing or placating, and not reporting, not asking for help from other people. And so when they start to do that, I think they're more likely to get the kind of critical feedback and the information they need to kind of recognize that this is an abusive relationship. This isn't just some sort of failure. You're not unlovable.
Right.
This is what they
So
need to communicate, for.
dad tells mom she's crazy and she should go to counseling. Mom goes to counseling and learns that dad's abusive.
Well, yeah, I think it's how abuse works, is that over time victims internalize more and more of those criticisms, and
Mhm.
really come to believe that they're unlovable, or that they're selfish, or somehow, rather than recognizing that they're with somebody who's incapable really of appreciating them for who they are, who kind of like is expecting them to be has these not taking responsibility for their own behavior, basically
Mhm.
like she's doing. She's bending over backwards, I
Right.
mean, quite often to kind of apologize and placate, and I
Mhm.
understand it from a safety perspective, but I think it ultimately becomes a trap.
Last question. I do think going through a divorce or breakup is an opportunity for the family dynamic to change. And you mentioned earlier, sometimes fathers are very motivated to be good fathers. they may not be open to attending 40 weeks of batterer intervention courses. Are there other courses, parenting courses, or anything else that you might be able to recommend that we may incorporate into a divorce or a separation agreement?
Well, the problem, Billy, is that a lot of the other programs don't have the same level of training and understanding of the issues, and so they're going to end up doing more harm than good. Couples counseling, for instance, or even individual therapy. Ends up being reinforcing a lot of the victim mentality that abusers have, too. So really good program, abuser intervention programs. First of all, we're not called batterers programs anymore because that's kind of a non-starter to be called a batterers program.
Got it. Okay. All right. What's the appropriate term?
Well, ours are called intimate partner abuse education programs. So that 35%, my program is very unusual in that we have 35% of our clients are voluntary. So we have really done a lot to kind of help, outreach, and to kind of like educate not just men in the community, but women who want change for their partners, and so we sometimes refer to them as partner mandated. So they're not mandated by the court, but the partner has asked them to attend our program. And so we've been very successful with that. And so, by the way, our program and many of the other good programs are online. So you can be anywhere in the country and attend a merge, for instance. Yeah. So you don't have to be limited by your own local program, which may not be as long, for instance. And you certainly shouldn't, settle for couples counseling. You certainly should settle for individual therapy that's going to end up usually being more harmful than good.
Got it.
Yeah.
I do think attorneys have the opportunity to tell their clients who might be abusive or being accused of being abusive that this type of program would be very good for your case.
Yeah, and we talk to the attorneys of our clients. Because they sometimes may complain that we're giving negative reports at the beginning, and say, well, look, help him to see the big picture, right? I mean, don't rev him up, right? Don't like him feel like he's a victim if he doesn't have contact with his children. Help him to see the long-term picture. What is it that he needs to do?
Exactly.
Right? That's going to enable other people to trust him.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for your time today. We have your contact information. We'll make sure everyone has it and they know how to contact you and they know how to get in touch with the program. I really appreciate your expertise, and it was great meeting you today.
Great. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks so much for listening to the Modern Arizona podcast. If you've enjoyed what you've heard today, make sure to download it, like it, leave a review, and share it with your friends. If you know someone who would be a good guest or you would like to be on the Modern Arizona podcast, make sure to give us an email or reach out to us at mymodernlaw.com.